Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome to Dulcimer Crossings Wednesday LiveStream. I'm Erin May, and I am joining you today from Kansas. Steve is in Boise, Idaho right now, getting ready to make a transition as he and his wife move from California. And so I get to do the live stream today. Yay! So I'm just making sure that everything is working. It looks like it is. I have to figure out how to make the sound go away on this. Okay, got it. Good. Excellent. Okay, so I can see comments on Facebook. I'm watching, and I can see comments if they happen on Vimeo too. So we're here, we're live streaming, and I'm going to talk to you today about the chromatic versus the diatonic dulcimer and do a little kind of demonstration and just walk you through like what happens when you put all the frets on the dulcimer to make it fully chromatic. How does that compare to the diatonic instrument? And so feel free to send any questions you have along the way. I switched from a diatonic dulcimer to a fully chromatic dulcimer as my primary instrument in 2010 after a few years of sort of playing around with a chromatic sometimes to see if I would like it. But in 2010, I got my David Beatty fully chromatic dulcimer, and I have been playing it as my primary instrument for performance and jamming, and the one that I just sit down and play when I'm playing for me, it's my chromatic dulcimer. I still use my diatonic dulcimer a lot when I am teaching and when I'm helping people figure out the instrument. Diatonic has some really valuable, well, there aren't a lot of wrong notes on a diatonic dulcimer, and so it's valuable to learn that way. But the chromatic has some cool things too. So I'm going to walk you through some of the things I love about chromatic. I am going to take this graphic off the bottom of the screen and switch to a camera where you can really see my two dulcimers up close. So this one in the, it's probably at the bottom of your screen, is my diatonic dulcimer. So it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then it has 6, 6.5, and 7. And then that repeats, that configuration repeats again in the second octave. So it also has the 13.5. So this is the sort of most traditional, and it's not the most traditional layout because the most traditional layout didn't have the 6.5 fret, but it's the one that's most common today is to have the 6.5 in there. So you can see that there are big spaces, and then there are a few small spaces. The 3rd fret is a small space, and then 6, 6.5, and 7 are 3 small spaces in a row here. So those are places where there's a half step musically. Where there's a big space, there's actually a note missing in between. So what happens when I look at the chromatic dulcimer is instead of having some big spaces and some small spaces, you see only small spaces all the way up the whole fretboard. So in this place on my diatonic dulcimer where there's a big space at the 1st fret, there are actually 2 frets on the chromatic dulcimer. And then in this second big space for the 2nd fret on the diatonic dulcimer, there are again 2 frets in this space. And then the 3rd fret where I have a dot on my diatonic dulcimer, I also have a dot on my chromatic dulcimer, and there's no extra fret there because base. Here's another big space on the diatonic dulcimer at the 4th fret. And then if I look at the chromatic dulcimer, there are again 2 frets in this space. And then the 5th fret on the diatonic dulcimer is another big space. and then I have 2 small spaces on the chromatic dulcimer. And then 6, 6.5, and 7 with the double dots on my diatonic dulcimer are the same on the chromatic dulcimer. 6, 6.5, and 7 with the double dots. So that's sort of the basic configuration of the chromatic dulcimer. Anywhere there's a big space on the diatonic dulcimer, there are 2 small spaces on the chromatic dulcimer. And we can name those frets in different ways. So some people, when they get a chromatic dulcimer, they choose to sort of think about the frets as if it was a guitar, where you're numbering every single fret from the beginning to the end. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 frets in the octave. And that makes a lot of sense unless you're trying to sort of go back and forth between the diatonic dulcimer and the chromatic dulcimer, at which point sometimes that can be really confusing. So some people also name all of the extra frets a half fret. So they would say 0, half, 1, 1.5, 2, 3, 3.5, 4, 4.5, 5, 6, 6.5, and 7. If you have a piano background at all, you know that between B and C on the piano and between E and F on the piano, there is no black key, or there is no sharpened flat. And so the same thing happens when we name our frets with diatonic numbers. There are 2 places where there's not a half fret between the numbers. So listen again: 0, half, 1, 1.5, 2, 3. There is no 2.5. 3.5, 4, 4.5, 5, 6. There is no 5.5. 6.5, and 7. Now the notes are going to be the same as the diatonic dulcimer notes. I've got my dulcimers both tuned to D-A-D. And so I can say the note names: D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C, C sharp, and D. And then I can find those same notes on the chromatic dulcimer, but I'm going to have to skip all the half frets to find those notes. D, E, I skipped a fret. F sharp, I skipped a fret. G, A, I skipped a fret. B, I skipped a fret. C sharp, I skipped a fret. And D, next to a fret. So my major scale is in the same place. It's got the same amount of whole steps and half steps. So if you look on the diatonic dulcimer, you start on open, and then there's a big space, small space, big space, skip a small space, so you're playing another big space, and then play the small space. That's the whole steps and half steps. So again, on the chromatic dulcimer, if I need a big space first, I know I'm going to have to skip a fret, and then I need another big space, so I skip a fret, and then I need a small space, so I go to the very next fret. I need another big space, so I skip a fret, a big space, I skip a fret, a big space, I skip a fret, and then I have my small space at the end. So you could call the big spaces whole steps and the small spaces half steps. Sometimes it's nice to think of it with that language if you're familiar with it, but if that's new language to you, just recognizing the size of the spaces on the diatonic dulcimer and how that sort of lays over top of the chromatic dulcimer is one of the things that was really helpful for me in the learning process with the chromatic dulcimer. So there's a couple of obvious benefits to the chromatic dulcimer. One of them is that you've got every extra note. So if you have a piece of music, a tune in the key of D, but it has some chromaticism in it, you can play every single note on the chromatic dulcimer without having to sort of jump around. Like an example is sometimes in the key of D, we'll have that have a G sharp in them. And there is a G sharp on the diatonic dulcimer. If you've got the 6.5 fret, you can find that note on the middle string at the 6.5 fret. There's a G sharp note, which is great, but if you're playing down here, and then the song calls for G sharp, You have to jump up a long ways to get to it, right? On the chromatic dulcimer, that note is just next door. So if I play 1, 2, and then I need a G sharp, I just play my 3.5 fret. It's right there on the melody string. So there is this ability to play the accidentals without having to do any fancy maneuvering. You don't have to look for a different tuning. You don't have to jump up to the middle string. You just have every note always. Another one that I use a lot, actually, sorry, my camera gets kind of jumpy and I just have to give it a rest, is the C natural note on the middle string. So some people have started adding 1.5 frets on their dulcimers to give them that, the F natural on the melody string and the C natural on the middle string. Old Joe Clark is this tune that uses the C natural note in the B part. I love to hear the C note in the melody, which requires me to jump over to the bass string if I don't have that extra fret. But on my chromatic dulcimer, it's right there. I didn't have to move my hand. I didn't have to make a big shift because I got the C natural note right here in the middle string. So there are some situations just in playing standard kind of fiddle tunes where I find myself just playing the accidental in the closest place on the chromatic dulcimer, where I might have had to jump to find it on the diatonic dulcimer. Another distinct advantage to the chromatic dulcimer is that I can very quickly and easily change keys to any key I want to without having to majorly rethink or retune. So I have learned that there are lots of ways to tune the diatonic dulcimer. You can raise it by, you can keep it in like the DAD orientation and raise the tuning by a half a step or a whole step, or you can put it into what's called a reverse tuning, like D, G, D, where the middle string becomes the root of the key that you're in. And all of those things are great, and I use them. And if I am at a jam session with a group of people who are changing keys, perhaps between every single song, or if I am doing a performance and I want to play Old Joe Clark in D, and then I want to play Red Haired Boy in A, and then I want to sing a love song in E flat. Well, I could probably make the first two happen on my diatonic dulcimer without changing anything, but playing chords to a love song in E flat is probably not going to work very well without some pretty significant retuning on my diatonic dulcimer. But on my chromatic dulcimer, here's E flat. So I could put a capo right there and have my drones matching E flat, or I can play my chords up the fretboard. Here's an E flat chord, and here's an E flat chord, knowing that the shapes of my chords are going to be consistent. So if I start with a D chord at 0, 0, 2, or 2, 0, 0, 0, 0, 2, 2, 0, 0, and my G chord at 3, 1, 0, 3, 1, 0, or 0, 1, 3. Play that same thing on the chromatic dulcimer, and then I play my A chord at 1, 1. And then here's a 1, 1 on the chromatic dulcimer. So here's my D chord and my G chord and my A chord on the chromatic. Now if I want those to be in E flat, I'm going to demonstrate it with the capo because it makes it really easy to visualize. So if I want this in E flat, I can put the capo on that very first fret on the dulcimer, the half fret. And now my dulcimer is sounding E flat, And if I think of this capo as 0, I count up 2 whole spaces on the bass string or on the melody string, and that gives me my 002 or 200 shape for the D chord. Then the G shape, or the 4 chord in the key, looks like G, except now it's not really G, it's A flat. And this isn't really D, it's E flat. And then here's my A shape, and that A shape is actually a B flat chord now. So without having to sort of relearn where my chords are, I can play in whatever key I need to be in without doing any retuning in between. So yeah, it takes a little second to put the capo on my chromatic dulcimer. But instead of having to retune 3 or 4 strings in order to play that love song in E flat, I can do it very quickly without making any significant change. And then they say, oh, now let's play a tune in the key of G. And I can say, great. And I can either play it open, or I could put the capo on in a position to make my drum strings G. And now I'm ready to play along with the next song. And so the ability to quickly change keys is one of the reasons that I have been drawn to the chromatic dulcimer as my sort of go-to instrument. I love playing with people. I love sharing my music in community and collaborative projects, which we all know has been a little more difficult in 2020 and into 2021. But I still find myself wanting to, for example, play along with a Facebook live stream that another band is performing, and I'll grab my chromatic dulcimer, and I can usually, by playing bar chords, figure out what key they're playing in. And then once I find the bar chord that matches the sound of the song that's being played, I can put my capo there, and then I can just play my 1, 4, and 5 chords out of whatever key that band is playing in. I can play along in my living room. It's really fun. I enjoy that a lot. It's one of the, I guess, pandemic silver linings is that bands that would never invite me on stage to play along with them, I have been playing along with whenever they do their live streams right in my living room. Hey, Jim Fry. I have recently seen a couple sort of backyard builders who are working on figuring out the idea of a fretless dulcimer. So one of the challenges with a fretless mountain dulcimer is how much of the time we spend working our way up and down the instrument. So my sister has a fretless banjo. So my understanding of the fretless banjo comes from watching her play. And she spends a lot of time in the first few frets because she's got 4 strings with an 1.5 octave range across the first few frets. And so she only occasionally slides up, and usually she's only sliding up to maybe what we would call the 4th or 5th fret. So there's a lot less of the kind of working your way up and down a single melody string, which is harder to intonate. It's harder to get it in tune as you're working your way up. Now, obviously, it's not impossible because, for example, cellos and basses are very large fretless instruments with very long scale lengths, and people play beautiful, beautiful melodies on them. So I imagine someday there will probably be some fretless dulcimers in the world. The other sort of instrument that's kind of a hybrid between fretted and fretless is actually the dulcibros that Steve often teaches with and talks about. So the dulcibro, when it's set up with the space between the nut and or the nut is high, so the strings are up off of the fretboard. They're not ever touching the fretboard. When you play with a slide along that, it is essentially fretless. The fret is underneath of it, but you have to line the slide up with the fret. The fret doesn't actually create the intonation for you, or the pitch change for you. So, yeah. It's interesting, Doug, going to your kind of comment about playing other chromatic instruments, but then it still feels really funny to translate any of that to the dulcimer. And my experience is that a lot of the other chromatic instruments are kind of backwards from the mountain dulcimer. So even if you have a sort of chromatic understanding of how instruments and chords work, there's still this kind of shift that has to happen in your thinking, because they're essentially backwards from the other kind of chromatic instruments with the bass string on the outside. I will say that I flat pick melodies a lot, meaning that I play them across the strings this way. And that is easy to do on a chromatic dulcimer. My hands kind of have their position. But if I'm playing Whiskey Before Breakfast up the fretboard, again, it gets really jumpy. You have to skip up and down quickly, and that's more difficult to do on the chromatic. Not impossible. I've practiced it a lot, right? And so I can still play the melodies up and down the melody string. But it certainly is more challenging. And so for people who lean toward the drone melody sound or a lot of movement on the melody string, the chromatic dulcimer is not necessarily a good solution. The retuning between songs is honestly probably a better solution than moving up and down. And if you look at old dulcimer books and strategies of folks like Jean Ritchie, who sang with her dulcimer a lot but played it in a drum noter style, she just did retune, and it isn't a big deal. Aubrey Atwater does a lot of retuning in between songs, and she's just gotten really good at practicing that, changing the tuning while she's telling the story about the next song. And so she doesn't find it really distracting to have to take the extra time to retune her dulcimer in between. And she does a lot of work on the melody string and moving up and down. So that's really a better fit. And then the chromatic dulcimer can be a really good fit for folks who want to play chords. I really, really like the chromatic dulcimer for chord backup playing. And it can be a really good fit for folks who are drawn to sort of playing across the strings to get those tunes, because it is easier not to have to jump a lot and skip all the frets. I always tease that when I got my chromatic dulcimer, I was very excited because it was suddenly going to have all the right notes for every song. And then I started playing it, and I discovered that I had all the wrong notes for every song. So it definitely does take some time to get used to which frets you are skipping. And when you have like a big skip on the diatonic dulcimer, like from 4 to 7, that's a really common one. Well, there aren't that many frets in between. It's really easy to kind of see out of the corner of your eye that 7th is the top of the set of skinny frets, but on the chromatic dulcimer, they all look the same. So you really have to practice the jumps musically to get them smooth and consistent. And sometimes you'll miss it and you'll land on 7.5, and that's not a problem that you a diatonic dulcimer where you could land on a note that's just completely outside of the key that you're in. So there are downsides to playing the chromatic dulcimer. For me, the downsides have been fewer than the upsides, and I really enjoy my chromatic dulcimer. I enjoy being able to read standard notation and not have to transpose it to D in order to be able to play the piece. So if I open up a hymnal, for example, and the piece in the hymnal is written with 3 flats, then I can just play it exactly the way it's written. I don't have to transpose it if I don't want to, so I can play along with the pianist who may be playing directly from that hymnal. But I also like that I can figure something out in one key and then realize, like, maybe that's not actually the best key for me to sing it in. And I can take all of the patterns and just move them to a different starting place. And then I'm playing the same thing, but I'm playing it in this other key without having to figure out which tuning would be the right one. And sometimes for me, when I'm figuring out what tuning I want to sing in, or what key I want to sing in, I don't always know. And so by kind of doing it with the chromatic dulcimer, I can try all the keys until I find the one that works. And that's harder to do with retuning because you kind of have to know what key you're looking for to figure out which tuning is going to work. So there are some advantages to having some sort of a chromatic instrument. It could be a piano or a guitar to find the key that you're looking for, the one that's going to work for the song that you're trying to arrange. But for me, in the singing process, the chromatic dulcimer has been really helpful to even find the key that's going to work best for me by trying all of them up and down the fretboard. So yeah, that's a little overview. And yes, Doug, I just got my DPN yesterday as well. And Dana Gruber is the one who wrote the article about learning the chromatic dulcimer. She's a great teacher and is really good at kind of simplifying the process. So definitely check out that article in the Dulcimer Players News. We also have a whole series of lessons on the chromatic dulcimer on the Dulcimer Crossing site. So be sure to go to Dulcimer Crossing and just, there's actually a place where you can click on Chromatic Dulcimer and it will bring up all the lessons that we have available on the site with the chromatic dulcimer. And I teach chromatic lessons privately and in 6-week class settings as well. So if you decide diving into the chromatic dulcimer is something that you want to do more, there aren't a lot of books. I have written a chord book for chromatic dulcimer, and Bing Futch has written sort of a method book for how to think about the frets and find familiar tunes on the chromatic dulcimer. But there aren't a ton of like published written resources yet. But that doesn't mean that you will be on your own. There are a variety of people who are starting to explore. We have a Facebook group for chromatic dulcimer. I think it's called Chromatic Dulcimer Friends, and would welcome you to join that if you want some support from other people who are learning to play the chromatic dulcimer as well. So hopefully that'll kind of help you, give you a little overview of chromatic versus diatonic dulcimer and some resources that you can follow up with if you want to explore this further. Thank you everyone for watching and participating in this Dulcimer Crossing Wednesday live stream. Steve will be back with you again next week, but I'm Erin May, and it has been a pleasure to join you today on this Wednesday morning. Y'all have a great day. Bye.